Good evening and welcome to the headquarters of Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, just outside Gloucester. Delighted to welcome you to Wildlife for January. And it's a bit of a different Wildlife this month, because rather than a panel, we've got a more intimate in conversation with Dame Glenys Stacey. Delighted you could join us tonight, Dame Glenys.
Thank you very much for the invite, thank you.
It's great to be here. Now, why have we got this conversation with Dame Glenys Stacey? It's because we want to really explore the new Office of Environmental Protection and hear about the work that they've been doing in their first year, and obviously also take your questions and put them direct to Dame Glenys, and we thought this was the very best way of doing it. My goodness, there's been a lot of interest about this tonight in advance. We've had over 200 questions from you submitted in advance. That's the level of interest, and a huge amount of number of you registered in advance to take part in this tonight. Do put in the comments where you're joining us from tonight. It's always wonderful to see where viewers from Wildlife are right across the UK and sometimes right around the world for these, so do let us know, and thank you for all your interest, and we will try and get through as many questions as we can, and during the course of the next hour help us all gain a better understanding about the work of the Office of Environmental Protection. So what is this thing that I'm talking about? Well, let's understand. Here's my very brief overview, and then we'll go to Dame Glenys to tell us a little bit more. But when the UK was a member of the EU, when us as NGOs, when communities or whoever felt that actually the government wasn't doing its job, or public bodies weren't doing their job in implementing and enforcing environmental legislation, what we could do is we could go to the European Commission, take a complaint to the European Commission and ask them to do something about it, really, and to investigate it. And of course, when we had Brexit, we made, as the Wildlife Trust and many other NGOs, made the point that we needed something equivalent here in the UK, where we could have a watchdog that meant that if we thought that public bodies or the government wasn't doing their job on enforcing environmental laws or doing it properly, that we had another place to go to. In other words, someone that could enforce the enforcers and look into all that. And that is the Office of Environmental Protection, set up through the Environment Act. Michael Gove at the time promised it would be a watchdog with teeth, and promised that it would do that job that we needed. So let's explore that tonight. Dame Glenys, thank you again for joining us. It's great you could join us and help us understand the work of this new watchdog. I've given a very basic first introduction there about the OEP and how it came about, but why don't you give a little bit more of an explanation? If I just say to you, what is the Office of Environmental Protection? What is it?
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. I think you did set the scene very well as to why we exist. We're a post-Brexit baby, aren't we? Filling a governance gap which would otherwise be there. We are a creature of statute. The Environment Act sets out in there the wide remit that we have. So to be particular about our job, we are making sure that government and all public bodies comply with environmental law, and we are monitoring government's own achievements and whether or not it is on set to achieve its own ambitions for the environment. We've got specific responsibilities in the Act. For example, we report each year on government's progress in its implementation of its own plan for the environment, and we've just done that last week. We also are able to give advice to government when they're thinking of changing the law, or when government requests advice from us. And of course, we've got inspection and enforcement powers as well. So we can also do specific reports on matters that we think of interest, where we think we can make a difference, if you like. So quite a wide remit extending to Northern Ireland and England, and sufficient powers, in my view, to try and make that difference that we so much need to see.
So I heard your chief executive say last week, you're not a first responder. Just explain a little bit more what she meant by that.
Well, she's quite right about that. So we're an oversight body, not a straightforward regulator. So you look at something like the Environment Agency, a regulator, or Natural England, an arm's length body of DEFRA. they have primary responsibilities, don't they, in relation to the environment and compliance with the law. We are one step removed from that. So we're looking across those arm's length bodies and government and local authorities, for example, and people who want to raise an issue with us, I'm afraid the law requires them to go through the first line first, if you like, take the issue to, say, the Environment Agency, and then if it's not resolved satisfactorily, then we're there and we can step in if the matter is serious.
So put simply, if people see loads of pollution going into the river, they should contact the Environment Agency.
They should.
If people experience the Environment Agency not doing enough about it, then they might contact you.
That's a good way of putting it. Thank you, Craig. Yeah.
So this body has been in existence now for about a year,
yes,
I think.
It has.
What have you been doing in your first year?
Thank you. So we have just had our first birthday, and it's
Happy
gone.
birthday.
Thank you, and it's gone very quickly. So obviously we've been establishing the organisation. We're based in Worcester. We now have about 70 staff, but of course, it takes a while to get that recruitment and underway, and to get all your processes and governance in place. So we're pretty well at the end of that set-up period. But we have been working and producing products in that time. So we've now done 2, I think, seminal reports on the state of the environment. The first one really last May, taking stock, and recommending to government an approach to planning for the environment. And then a report we published just last week, which is actually a more detailed assessment ourselves of the state of the environment and the extent to which government is actually meeting its strategic aims, its specific goals, its environmental targets and so on. So that's almost like a benchmark for government. It can see, it's got a baseline there, that it can work from. But we've also been giving advice to government on a range of issues, for example, the retained European Law Bill, and we'll probably get on to that, or LERB, a number of other things, the Nature Green Paper, you'll remember that. We've been very busy getting our advice into the right place at the right time to try and make a difference. And you'll know that as well, we were, I think, influential in making sure that the government did ultimately last year produce its statutory targets for the environment. We've started...
A bit late, of course.
Well,
they missed the legislative deadline, but they did eventually do them.
They did. And then the other thing that we've done, which you'll know about, is started a significant investigation into the regulatory oversight of the management of combined sewage overflows. So looking at the respective roles of the Secretary of State, Ofwat, and the Environment Agency in relation to the management of CSOs.
So there's been huge public attention on this over the last couple of years of just the amount of sewage in our rivers. So it seems quite fitting that one of the first reports you do would be looking into that. But can you say just a little bit more about, so what are you looking at in particular there?
Yes, of course I can, yes. So we thank you for recognising how important this issue is. And indeed, water generally is one of our priorities, so we might be able to speak a bit more about that if time allows. And we started this investigation actually the day after our enforcement policy was established and in, so we were ready and going for it. What we're looking at, we take the view that if you really want to know what is going right and what is going wrong about the oversight of water, a good start point is to really understand the respective responsibilities of those who do oversee it. So that is the 3 players that I mentioned just now. See whether those roles and responsibilities sit well together or overlap unduly, or if there's any lack of clarification. Also to see whether they suit actually the issues of the modern day. We're 20 years on from when some of this was first established, and whether it's now suited to the expectations of the public, for example, in terms of the quality of fresh water. You really want to see whether it's sufficiently suitable. And then also, just to make sure we understand fully to what extent each of these individual bodies or players are actually doing what they're expected to do. So are they actually delivering as expected? So in other words, just mapping out really how things should work and how things actually work. That's it in a nutshell. Seemed a good starting point to us.
And what do you expect might be the timescales on that report?
Oh, I would expect to get to some findings certainly well before the end of this calendar year. I'm hoping, we'll get somewhere a bit earlier than that.
Right. So obviously the other thing you mentioned is that just last week you published this report that I'm holding now, the
Yes.
Progress in Improving the Natural Environment in England. Tell us a little bit more about that report and what were the main headline conclusions?
I should say, first of all, you're very lucky to have a hard copy. I haven't got one yet. And
I made sure.
We only produced a few because, just don't want to use paper unduly, but I'm desperate to get hold of one myself.
But this is online, it's worth saying.
It is online.
Everyone can find this online. Progress in Improving the Natural Environment. It was published last week. And it's on the OEP website.
Thank you. So we were looking in some detail as to the extent to which governments met its various environmental goals and targets. We were using data and management information that is the government's data. And I suppose one of our first findings actually was that there are gaps in that data. You'll see there are some tables in there where we have grey boxes for where we're not able to reach a conclusion. And in my view, there are too many grey boxes. And I'd be very interested to see how much progress we can make with government in getting those data gaps filled, if you like, before we next report. But what we found, we looked at 32 environmental trends. There we found 9 were going in a positive direction, 11 neutral, and most of the others declining. But there were 4, as I say, that we couldn't really make an assessment because of the lack of data. We looked at 23 environmental targets and found none of them were demonstrably set to be achieved. So it was a rather dismal picture. Having said that, there were a couple of areas where there was some good news. On air quality, for example, there have been improvements in recent years, although there are still, I know, issues in specific areas, and particularly, urban living, is a tricky issue. And there were also improvements in people's enjoyment of nature. Now, some of those improvements on air quality and enjoyment of nature were down to the way that we changed our behaviours during lockdown, during pandemic lockdowns, but not all of it.
Less.
Yes,
Going out
driving
more
less,
and into
enjoying
local nature. Yeah.
But it's not all down to that. I mean,
Right.
in air quality, there is some coherence in air quality policy, for example, and local authorities know what they're doing. So I've always said that things that are organised well are more likely to be delivered, and you can see that actually in relation to air quality work. Not that there isn't more to be done. There is. Yeah.
And but your headline conclusions in that report were pretty stark, weren't they? That at the moment we're not seeing nearly enough progress to deliver on the government's 25-year environment plan.
That's right. It's our job, Craig, to reflect the evidence back to government, to act like a mirror, really, to say, look, this is how it is on the ground. We are using established data, that is government data. We're not over-egging it or under-egging it, but we do have to reach a conclusion. And it's hard to avoid concluding that much more needs to be done if government is to meet its ambition to leave the environment in a better state for the next generation. Now, there are opportunities, aren't there? We're expecting an environmental improvement plan after 5 years of having one. The next one comes out.
Next
We're
Tuesday,
anticipating it next week. That's right.
Yes.
And we've given government...
We know it's next Tuesday because the government has booked one of our sites to launch it from, so we know it's next Tuesday.
Well, I'm relieved to hear that. I'm relieved to hear that. That's great news. We're expecting it that day as well, but it looks like something concrete is happening. And of course, we want to see, so far as possible, that the advice we've given government in 2 seminal reports is reflected at least to some extent in that, so that we can see a good plan that can be implemented, that we're clear about the delivery arrangements, and that we are building the data and monitoring and evaluation to make sure we all know soon enough whether policy initiatives are working on the ground or not.
There's so many things. I have to say, it is a really good report, and it's really worth looking at. There's an awful lot of work that's gone into it. One of the things that I was particularly pleased to see you give some real attention to is the loss of abundance of key species. This is something I've been really keen and focused about for many years, because I kind of feel that in a way, even in the conservation community over 100 years, we've focused on species diversity and species rarity and the loss of that. And that's important, of course it is, but actually it's, in many ways, it's the loss of our abundance of species that says more about ecosystem health.
It's a really good indicator, isn't it, for broad issues relating to the environment, because it's so deeply associated with habitat.
It is, absolutely is. And one of the things you said very clearly in there is you've made the point, which we all know, that there's been these appalling declines in abundance, 40% declines in some bird species, 75, 80% declines in insect species in the last 40 years. But I think the point that you made really clearly is actually the rate of that decline has not slowed down.
No, I know.
So you look at a graph and it looks
it's
like it might have slowed down, but actually, of course, it's because it's the same percentage reduction from a smaller amount looks less, but actually, sadly, the rate of decline is still the same.
And it is really daunting when you see it graphically presented, isn't it? So an 82% decline over the last half century or so. I mean, I'm old and I've lived through that half century as an adult, so I know, the obvious signs, the lack of bird life in my garden compared to what I might have seen half a century ago, for example. But yes, and the measures that we've been able to look at, Craig, they only go to 2018. A point we make in our report. Government has a target to halt species decline by 2030. We really do. If there's one place, where we urgently need, where we urgently need the data, it is there, isn't it?
We've got to move a lot faster, haven't we, in doing that. So, Dame Glenys, you're a solicitor by profession. You previously served as Her Majesty's, and it was then Her Majesty's, Chief Inspector of Probation. And Chief Executive at Animal Health, and was appointed Chair Designate of the Office of Environment Protection in December 2020, and then obviously became Chair on Legal Creation of the OEP. Why did you want this job?
Do you know, I thought it was going to be This Is Your Life, Ben, and you were going to produce a red book for me.
Why did you throw your hat in for this?
Why did I want it? Well, it's the best job in the world, isn't it? I'm a seasoned regulator, I love regulation. It makes me happy. If it works well, it can work well, it can work really badly. I've had a lot of regulatory experience. I've also, as you've indicated, had jobs where I've had to objectively evaluate evidence, come to conclusions, and then tell government that something is working or isn't working. I've set up or transformed a number of public sector bodies, and I've been a chair and chief executive and board member of them as well. And so I thought I'd got something to offer. I'm not an environmentalist, but I have, done a lot of work in animal health, for example. 70% of our land is in agricultural use. I've been down any number of farm tracks, and I think I understand land management and farming. So I thought I had something to offer. But to be honest, I couldn't resist it. I mean, I thought I brought that to the table, and I thought if I want to make the biggest difference I can at the age I'm at, this is it. This is the job that I would have wished for. Yeah.
Now, the remit of the Office of Environmental Protection includes England, but it actually, very importantly, also includes Northern Ireland.
It does now, yes.
And Northern Ireland, I've been there for many, many years and followed environmental issues in Northern Ireland for many years. And it's a very different context, isn't it? And you have experience of working in Northern Ireland as well, don't you? Well,
I do. When I was Chief Executive of the Criminal Cases Review Commission, its remit extended to Northern Ireland. This was back in 1997, the early 2000s. And of course, it was fresh after the Troubles, and, there were a lot of potential miscarriages to investigate there. And also it was a sensitive time and a sensitive issue, obviously. I did spend quite a lot of time in Northern Ireland, which I hope now stands me in good stead. You'll know from your own experience and interest that things work differently in Northern Ireland. And it's a mistake to assume that they don't. It's really worth trying to understand as well as possible how things work and how you can then best make a positive difference.
Absolutely, it's crucially important. I think it is going to be very useful to have your experience looking at it in Northern Ireland, and there's an awful lot that needs to be done. We're going to get into that a little bit more tonight as well. Just to let you know some of the comments that have been coming in tonight. Nick Sherwood has said, CSOs, that's the combined sewage overflows, perfect example of where things are failing big time. Also, William Rose has said, will a government who bring back bee-killing pesticides listen? We've had that kind of comment coming because that's a big issue that we've followed as the wildlife trusts. Tim Webb has said, looking forward to hearing more, keen to hear how we can collectively overcome blockages preventing us delivering the Sustainable Development Goals and net zero. Watching from East London. And it's amazing public green spaces, very nice. I did say we had so many questions, over 200 questions from you all submitted in advance. And it won't surprise you, Dame Glenys, a lot of the questions were essentially questioning, the independence and teeth of the OEP. So Josephine Adams asked, does the new OEP have any real teeth and funding support to address the breaches of environmental protections? Jenny Floyd said, how independent can a civil servant be? Are you paid from the public purse, which is administered by government through taxation? Sue Callum said, how sharp will the OEP's teeth be? What can they do if government departments are clearly doing things that are against the interests of the environment? And, well, many other questions from there as well. John McKenzie said, are there sanctions that the OEP can impose if government or others fail to fulfil their obligations in relation to the environment? So a whole load of questions. Yes. That gives you a flavour of some of the questions we had there. Do you have teeth, and are you prepared to use them, and are you independent?
Right, let's start with independence first then. So yes, I'm a civil servant, and we are all at the OEP paid from the public purse. There are some protections about our independence in our enabling legislation. So, for example, there has to be an annual report on our independence. We report to government annually and so on. So there are some protections there. But basically, in my experience, independence is all in the doing, whatever the statutory provisions are. If you're not careful in these sorts of jobs, independence can be sort of shaved off, like cheese on a cheese grater. Your funding may be reduced, or, your report's not taken into account, or all of these things. You're, difficult to get board members or whatever. I've been around the block a few times. I have had a job, as you say, as Chief Inspector of Probation, where I was presenting evidence to government that their model for probation wasn't working, and it has now changed. I've certainly, as Chief Regulator for Qualification, stood up for standard in the face of enormous pressure, not just from government, but from other stakeholders as well. I believe I have an absolute track record of independence. And personally, the one thing I'm really proud of is that I have always tried to do the right thing, even if that puts me in the firing line. That's what I've done. So I would hope that people would, despite the fact that we're paid from the public purse, suspend disbelief. That's my ask, really. Yeah. Suspend disbelief and give the OEP and its chair a chance to prove that we are independent. And I believe we're off to a good start. When it comes to whether we've got teeth, it's a very interesting debate, this, because we are replacing a mechanism that was a European mechanism, but was slightly different. So, we can, for example, take enforcement proceedings against public bodies, not just government. So, in a way, we've got a broad smile, if you like, in terms of where we can actually go to. We don't have the full suite of classic regulatory enforcement powers, but as we've discussed, we're not a classic regulator. So we're not able to fine, for example, but we are able to take proceedings. We are able to take, like, the equivalent of judicial review proceedings. We can take government to court. But the idea behind the OEP is not that we are what you might call a serial nitpicker, taking every signature, but that we are a strategic litigator, that we only really resort to litigation where we've not been able to resolve the issue, for example, by dialogue. And a good example of that, actually, is the government's efforts to get those statutory targets in time and certainly get them in by the year end. Mm-hmm. I do believe you're influential in getting those in by the year end, but it was through dialogue. It was through discussion and not through resorting to proceedings.
But potentially with the threat that that's where you could go if not.
It's always there.
So a particular question here, I mean, Mark Illy has asked the question, how will the Office of Environmental Protection best integrate with the Environment Agency and Natural England? And perhaps it's not the word integrate, that's the word that's being used, but how will you, I mean, obviously for our audience tonight, there will be a lot of interest in how you'll work with, or more to the point, hold to account the Environment Agency and Natural England.
Right.
Can you, let's say a bit specifically about those bodies.
And it is a sort of multifaceted relationship, this. It's not unusual, actually, in regulatory circles. But on the one hand, we are overseeing the Environment Agency and Natural England and other bodies and wanting to make sure that the law is complied with. So we have that oversight role. To do that well, we have to understand those agencies sufficiently well, understand their budget, any constraints, their priorities, how they work, in order to evaluate really what they're doing. So we do need to have established working relationships, if you like, to make sure that we have that understanding. So on the one hand, we are meeting at a working level to be able to do that. But of course that doesn't change the position when it comes to oversight. So as I've said to you, our first investigation is into the Environment Agency alongside Ofwat and the Secretary of State. The fact that we have a working relationship for sound business purposes doesn't stop an organisation from doing the right thing. Yeah.
Well, let's also talk about looking across a UK perspective, across the 4 nations of the UK. Your remit, of course, as I said, covers England and Northern Ireland.
That's right.
But there will be equivalent separate organisations set up in Wales and Scotland. How do you plan to work with your counterparts in devolved nations? Because obviously there will be, there's quite a few kind of cross-border issues.
And
that
actually
are
we are
here.
working with our counterparts now. It's not something for the future, it's something now. And indeed, at the end of the month, we have a whole day summit, actually, with those bodies. It's going to be in Edinburgh and hosted by Environmental Standards Scotland. So we're already in that close working relationship. Regular meetings take place at a working level and at chair level as well. In fact, we were together just the other day. So we are all finding our feet and all identifying areas where we have common ground. For example, the retained European Law Bill. Very common ground, isn't it?
I will come to that shortly, I can guarantee it. But while we're still on this point, one of the issues raised in advance, a question that I received in advance, was from our very own Ulster Wildlife. So I definitely need to ask this question. And it's around, it's about the evidence base and data transparency in Northern Ireland, and that they say lots of environmental data just isn't publicly available in Northern Ireland. And their question is, can the Office of Environmental Protection play a role in helping resolve this?
Yeah. It is disheartening, isn't it, to find that? I mean, I know we've found data gaps here in England, but I'm quite able to believe that we'll have at least the same issue in Northern Ireland, if not worse. Now, our job is to actually, in the same way that we've just reported on progress here in England in delivering the Environmental Improvement Plan commitments, we have the same responsibility in Northern Ireland. So we will, before too much longer, be reporting in a similar way in relation to progress in Northern Ireland. And I envisage that when we're doing that, we're going to identify those data gaps. And your colleagues in Northern Ireland can perhaps help us with that, so that we can at least get it open on the record. Now, the data gaps we've identified in England, we've already had a preliminary conversation with DEFRA about how those gaps might be filled, and we'll be following that through. And let's hope we can get the same traction in Northern Ireland. You don't really get anywhere until you know what your baseline is, and you're able to monitor and evaluate and correct. It's just basic control loop stuff, isn't it? So we'll want to see improvement where needed, definitely.
Very good. I know Ulster Wildlife would be very pleased to work with you on doing just that. Now, we've been talking about this thing called the Retained EU Law Bill. If you've been abroad or something the last few weeks, and you need to know what the Retained EU Law Bill is, or you've never watched Wildlife Trust before or followed us on social media, here's my very brief description of it. huge amounts of legislation generally in the UK was developed in an EU context, but that was particularly true of environmental legislation, and for good reasons, because strangely enough, the environment never recognises national borders. So it's actually good to cooperate across national borders on environmental matters. And for that reason, a huge amount of our environmental legislation was developed in an EU context. And then, of course, when the UK took the decision to leave the EU, when that was happening, the decision was made that the easiest thing to do for simplicity and to, using someone else's words, get Brexit done, the easiest thing was in 2018 to pass the withdrawal bill, which actually took all EU legislation and essentially cut and pasted it into UK law. So all that EU legislation became UK law through the Great Withdrawal Bill in 2018. But then there was a sense amongst some parts of the political spectrum, I'm trying to say this as neutrally as possible, that actually there's also need to then go back and deal with, get rid of some of that legislation that existed and was developed in an EU context. And this was promised by Rishi Sunak during his leadership campaign, promised by Liz Truss, in fact, as well. In fact, Boris Johnson previously promised it as well. And so there's a bill going through Parliament at the moment that was first introduced by Jacob Rees-Mogg to Parliament in the brief period that he was Cabinet Minister during the Liz Truss government. And this bill, the retained EU law bill, actually says that all legislation and regulations that were developed in an EU context during our time as members of the EU will cease to exist on the 31st of December this year, unless the relevant minister decides to keep it or amend it. And as far as the environment's concerned, this relates to over 1,000 pieces of environment legislation and regulations. Now, we've been very clear as the Wildlife Trust. We think this is an appalling piece of legislation. We haven't held back on this at all. We think it's deeply ideological. There's actually no need for it. We believe that, in fact, EU retained law is an invented construct because it's actually all UK legislation already now. And we absolutely see the need to evolve that legislation. In fact, in nearly all cases on environment, we want to make it stronger and we want to do it better in the UK than perhaps it was done in the EU. But we want to do it in a calm and collective way and consult on it and think about it and do it calmly rather than have this arbitrary deadline of the 31st of December. So there's been a bit of a hoo-ha about it over the last little while, not least because we've tried to make a hoo-ha about it as well. But I'm very pleased to say we're not alone in that. Dame Glenys, you chose as the Office of Environment Protection, you weren't required to, but you chose as the Office of Environmental Protection to submit evidence to the parliamentary committee that was looking into the retained EU law bill. Why?
Well, I think we share the concerns of many environmentalists. You know, I think I'd probably argue that if government is to achieve its objectives for the environment, it doesn't just need to retain current levels of protection, it needs to enhance them. This bill at the moment does not have a non-regression provision in it. Indeed, one of our recommendations in our evidence back in November was that it should have a non-regression provision in it. So at least we'd have that.
Meaning the regulation can't get weaker.
Absolutely, the controls can't get any weaker, and we don't have it in there. In other legislation going through at the moment, we do see those sorts of provisions, but not in this bill. So it is a little alarming, you know, to see that. So certainly that concern is very much in our minds. We've also got concerns about the achievability, I think I'd put it that way. I think it's about 1,200 pieces of legislation at the moment identified on DEFRA's rule list. It's not a complete list yet. That's an awful lot to try and get through by December 23.
That's about 5 pieces every working day, isn't it?
You're obviously better at maths than me, but it's a lot. And the fact is that changes to the law that are rushed are not necessarily good changes. It's risky to rush changes to the law. And things can be missed. Things could inadvertently just fall through the cracks and be dropped. That's not how government should wish to actually approach such an important issue as the protection of our environment and enhancement to meet its ambition. So we have recommended that the December 23 date is looked at again, and we're not the only ones who are worried about that date. There are also concerns that we have about the specific position in Northern Ireland. So the provisions in the bill, when it becomes an act, if it does as it's drafted now, enable governments to move from the 23 date up to, I think, 26 if they decide for some pieces of legislation. That's really difficult for Northern Ireland because it hasn't effectively got a government. Its assembly is not sitting. So
and it's unlikely to for the rest of this year.
That's right. So there is a real constitutional problem there. And at the moment, the face of the bill doesn't address that. Now, I'm sure there's going to be a debate about that, in the Lords and then back in the Commons, about how that is dealt with, because otherwise Northern Ireland and the environment in Northern Ireland is left in a really invidious position. So certainly a concern about that. And then just one other thing we did raise in our advice, actually, was that there's not any real clarity at the moment about the process that departments will go through in reviewing their established law, and no transparency over that either. And we think that needs to be redressed, really. We really need to know what the approach will be, not just in DEFRA, but in other departments. And I would hope that we'll see greater clarity about that pretty soon now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's worth saying we've raised specific concerns about the impact that the retained EU law bill will have for Northern Ireland, just as Dame Glenys was saying here. As the Wildlife Trust, we've asked questions directly to DEFRA. And indeed, just last week, we went into number 10 Downing Street and asked number 10 Downing Street officials what the answer was with respect to Northern Ireland, and they said they'd get back to us because they don't have an answer at the moment. They still haven't got back to us, and yet the bill has already passed its third reading in committee stage and gone to the House of Lords.
Could I mention something else here,
Please
Craig?
do.
Because actually, I hope you, like we do, recognise there are opportunities here. I've mentioned the need to strengthen protections, and we know that some of the regulatory schemes are rather crunchy and clumsy and hard to sort of get through. And there is a chance to actually make that easier and more likely to be effective, and that's what we really want to promote at the OEP. Just as a background to that, we're doing some work now and looking at how the Water Framework Directive works, how that is translated into river basin management plans, what is right and wrong about that whole area of the oversight of the water environment, because we see the potential for significant improvement. But it always helps when you're hoping to improve matters to know how it is at the moment. So having a detailed assessment of how it is at the moment, we think would help government, actually, as it comes to think about how could we actually oversee water more effectively. Yeah.
Yes, well, we have had a lot of questions about water, and you touched on it earlier about the specific report, but I think, no, it won't surprise you, we've had so many questions about water, it's worth saying that. And it is a good example, is that I think probably the government will say, yes, we'll keep the Water Framework Directive, but we all think it could be done better. I mean, all the pollution in our rivers suggests it's not working brilliantly at the moment, so it could be done better. We would say at the Wildlife Trusts, come up with the alternative before you get rid of the current one, for sure, and put that in place. And unquestionably, it could be done better, but there could be much better enforcement on this as well. And that's, as you indicated, that's exactly being your first priority to look into that. But let's just explore this a little bit more. We had questions from, because it has been such a hot topic on the questions we had in advance. Mary Thornton asked, will the OEP have powers to directly fine water companies for discharging sewage into rivers and streams? And you've sort of answered this already, but let's just answer again just to be clear on that.
So we don't have fining powers, so we're not fining anybody, water company or not, that's the first thing. Secondly, we have an oversight role, as I've explained, and actually water companies, when they're undertaking public duties, are classified as public bodies. But the point is, I mentioned earlier, we're not the first responder. So any clear breach, one would look first to the appropriate regulators, the Environment Agency and Ofwat. Yeah.
So it's just really important to be clear about that. But the fact is, you have already started this investigation.
Yes, water is one of our priorities for the year ahead, and we've got a specific large-scale investigation going on, quite a complex issue about really getting to the root of who should be doing what, if you like, in order to properly oversee combined sewage overflows. And then another piece of work we've just started, as I said, in relation to looking more closely at the Water Framework Directive and how things are working. And it doesn't mean that we won't have other water projects this year. Like others, we're planning our year ahead, at about this time of year. So it's definitely very much a priority for us.
We've actually had quite a lot of questions from people saying, what can, this is less your remit, but I'll ask you anyway,
Yes.
What can people do in the meantime? People that are very frustrated. We've had responses tonight hearing about the report that it will come out at some point this calendar year. Individuals that are really frustrated at seeing pollution in their rivers, what would you recommend they do?
Well, that's a difficult question, and I'm allowing the OEP time to properly complete an investigation and come to findings. And I'm hopeful, as I said, that it would be well before the end of the year, but I don't want to be drawn on that. As to what people can do, it's interesting, the whole issue of combined sewage overflows is so visceral, isn't it? It really has caught the public imagination. There's very few days that go by that there isn't some media coverage about it. We've got an Environmental Audit Committee very focused indeed on combined sewage overflows and the wider issues of water quality. I don't see any risk of this going away. I mean, I saw the Secretary of State yesterday before a select committee being questioned about the management of water. It's not going to go off the agenda, I don't think. We do know that there's an EIP, a new Environmental Improvement Panel. Let's see what it says next week about water. We also know that government has indicated it is likely to present a wider water strategy in the coming months, and I'd be very interested in seeing that as well. And we need to actually keep government's feet to the fire in the sense of making sure that we see as soon as possible the appropriate steps to better oversee water. And, we're playing our full part in that.
Right, thank you. Well, we also had questions that relate to this, but take us to a different place. And it's worth saying you previously, not in this role, but in a previous role, undertook a sort of inquiry into agricultural regulation.
Yes.
Do you want to say a little bit about what that was?
Yes, absolutely. So this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, I think, that I was asked by government to conduct a review of the way farming is regulated. I was really pleased to be able to do that with a small team, and that the report is still available actually on the web should people wish to see it. But of course, the way we regulated farming was very much driven by our membership of the European Union. Everyone will have heard, for example, about common agricultural payments and those payments being geared to acreage rather than the environment. So there's lots of opportunities actually to regulate farming differently and to use a really wide gamut of regulatory tools, including incentivisation, to make sure that the 70% of our land that's in agricultural use delivers, I think, what Michael Gove would have called public goods for public money. And the public goods are really focused, hopefully, on improvements to the environment.
So we had quite a bunch of questions specifically on this, so it's just worth playing it through a little bit more. Naomi Oakley asked, can you describe what good regulation would look like for farmers and land managers? What regulatory measures need to be in place to allow wildlife and people to thrive? Richard Howell asked, DEFRA have identified that the single biggest driver of preventing water bodies achieving good status is agricultural pollution, affecting 40% of our water bodies. Will the Office of Environment Protection intervene on issues such as this, where existing policies are obviously failing? So that's not about the water companies there or combined sewage overflows. It's about that pollution from agriculture and issues about regulation in that. Again, Richard asking here, is it time for agriculture to be put on a level regulatory playing field compared to other industries?
Very interesting. I'm so glad to hear people so interested in the way regulation can work. So I spoke just now about a wide gamut of regulatory approaches, and if you think of it as a dial, starting with really hard-nosed, hard a set of rules. They are required in situations where public health or safety is at risk. So in farming, for example, if you've suddenly got a foot and mouth disease outbreak, hard rules come in. That's hard edge regulation to protect the public. You go through a spectrum of approaches, including some collaborative approaches, and at the softest end of the spectrum, if you like, one end hard edge rules, the other end is really incentivisation. Now, good regulators are looking to make a positive difference, and they're looking at each issue and saying, which is the best regulatory approach for that? So one might say, for example, if the issue is an alarming percentage of farms have leaking slurry tanks with a proportion of that leaking into the neighbouring watercourse, what is the way that you're going to reduce that? And it might be, you think, well, hard rule, you've got to sort of mend your slurry tank or you get fined. But a lot of these farmers are not in a position to do that. They're not in a financial position to do that, and they're unlikely to get a loan from their bank to do it either. That does drive you more towards the soft end of the spectrum and whether one can incentivise repair, replacement, or at least coverage of slurry tanks. So my point really, in a roundabout way, is you need to regulate for the issue that you're trying to deal with. I also argued in my review of farm regulation that you need a whole farm approach. So to carry on that analogy, you don't want a farmer getting an incentive payment for planting trees if the other side of his farm, his slurry tank's leaking into the water. So it is a question, a lot of this is actually about being very clear with the farming community as stewards of our environment and generally doing a good job, what is now expected, because the expectations have changed and government has more levers now that we've left Europe. It can decide, and it's already promising us, isn't it, a land use framework later this year. I'm looking forward to that. It can decide and help farmers in its stewardship, and it can be quite specific about that. And that is a regulatory approach, an incentivisation of farmers to deliver for the environment. Not that they're not good stewards already, vast majority are.
So this review of farming regulations you produced was published in 2018. So 5 years later, on balance, do you feel the government has acted on your recommendations?
It certainly has considered them, and I think it has influenced government, for example, in its environmental land management framework.
Well, just to bring us bang up to date on that, the government published new details about environmental land management schemes today for England. These are the subsidy regimes that support farmers on environmental matters. As the Wildlife Trust, we've been following this, of course, very closely, and we've been very critical to date of some of the progress that's been made to date. But I think we started to see some things in the right direction today. The government announced that it would produce payments for integrated pest management. Many of you would know that's something I'm particularly obsessed about. So in other words, rewarding farmers to move to using fewer pesticides and farming in a way that doesn't need pesticides. So having many crops growing together so that it's less of a monoculture and therefore you don't need so many use of pesticides and so on. And we see generous payments there. We also see, I'm pleased to say, more money coming forward for landscape recovery, which is really important as well, since that's the one part of these schemes that has been oversubscribed. There's been actually a lot of interest from farmers in that. Government has also confirmed that the mid-tier on local nature recovery is going to be basically changed to continuing with countryside stewardship and taking that further, which we understand why that's happening. There's 50,000 farmers already in countryside stewardship. It's good to kind of carry them over into that. But we think it's important the government continues to think about how countryside stewardship can be used to deliver on the requirements of local nature recovery. Countryside stewardship at the moment works at the individual farm level as opposed to the wider landscape level. So if we're going to be paying farmers to put hedgerows back, that's a great thing, but let's make sure they connect with the hedgerows being put in the farm next door so that you create those kind of highways for wildlife and it all joins up. So that's very important. But we'll keep monitoring this. We've said today, steps in the right direction, but there's still a long way to go on that agricultural transition. But at least we're seeing steps in the right direction, which I think is encouraging. Now, Dame Glenys, Again, Wildlife Trust supporters will have absolutely followed our attendance and our involvement in COP15, the UN Biodiversity Conference in Montreal in December, where it was the first UN summit I've ever been to in my life, which I think we got a better result than I expected in advance.
Yes.
The UK government, signed up enthusiastically to the outcome, committing us to try and get 30% of our land and inland waters and sea in recovery by 2030, committing us to halving the harm from pesticide use by 2030 and halving nutrient pollution by 2030, just 7 years away, just to name one of the many, many targets in that. What role might the OEP have in ensuring the UK government, with respect to England and Northern Ireland, actually make sure they deliver on international targets they've signed up to?
Thank you. Can I say, first of all, that what you're pointing to here is part of a broader picture. So,
of course,
as the OEP was created and we looked at where things stood in relation to targets, over actually some decades now, isn't it? Our country has committed to various treaties and signed various obligations, and there are any number of targets and expectations set there. And I think for all of us, actually, there's quite a lot of confusion about which of those are still existing or not, and which of those is government absolutely committed to. And certainly we would like to see greater clarity, not just in the case of the most recent commitments, but looking back over that period, it would help. And it's part of another plea we've made to government about really establishing and making plain what we would call the hierarchy of targets. So we've got an environmental improvement plan next week. We hope to see a top target or apex target for each of the goals that government has in that plan, and then a proper hierarchy of targets beneath that we can see how things come together and contribute to achievement of the apex target. Now, it may be that international obligations that we've signed up to have a part to play there. We are not directly kind of overseeing compliance with international commitments, but if those international commitments are translated into English law, then we have a lever there because we expect English law to be complied with. But of course, most of them aren't. But they can sit, in that hierarchy. Do you follow? We really need that hierarchy and to see what the place of those things is.
And that's missing at the moment, isn't it? It's not clear at all where that is,
really
how they relate.
It's really difficult because there have been so many commitments made.
I find it for me a really interesting question is that if the Environment Improvement Plan is published on Tuesday, that's just 1 month after COP15 in Montreal.
To what extent is it reflected?
Yeah.
Yes.
I rather suspect it's out of date even when it's published. It's probably been the thinking and it's been developed before COP15. They've been finalising it this last month. But I hope at the very least the Secretary of State in announcing it will recognise that perhaps and recognise they need to come back and improve it, because we have to have things like the Environment Improvement Plan. If they don't deliver on international commitments like those made at COP15, it's going to be a real problem.
Well, I know what we're looking for in the Environmental Improvement Plan. So we're looking for clear goals, apex target for each goal, sufficient overall vision, really good cross-government governance arrangements to pull together the efforts to actually deliver the plan, clear delivery arrangements for each of the goals in the plan, ambitious, suitably ambitious interim targets which are expected at the same time as well, a good significant improvement assessment that's also required at the same time, and I keep going on about it, but better monitoring, evaluation and learning arrangements that we can see quickly enough whether policy is working, whether it's being implemented well, and whether there needs to be any tweaks or more fundamental changes. That is our sort of focus, actually, and that's how we will be looking at the EIP on Tuesday to see to what extent it meets what we would wish to see by way of requirements.
So that's a lovely list you've just given. If you look at it on Tuesday and it's missing any of those, what do you do?
Well, we'll need some time to have a look at it, Craig. I'm not sure we'll have a view on Tuesday.
I'll give you a day or so.
Give us a bit of time to look at it. We do have a range of options, actually. I don't want to go into all of those because it wouldn't be appropriate to do so, but the first thing is to seek to influence. So government would be reporting on progress and delivering that during this calendar year. It has a chance to iterate the plan. I mean, one of our arguments has been that it wouldn't necessarily be sensible to plan one plan for the next 5 years of the environment and to keep it entirely static. It has an opportunity to develop that plan in response to its own monitoring, and we would certainly urge that where we saw there was any particular weakness that we thought could and should be addressed.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's very important. So we're running out of time, unbelievably. We're just in the last few minutes. So a couple of other questions that I think will be really important to ask you. I mean, let's be clear. How can the general public engage with the Office of Environment Protection? I mean, you said you're not a first responder. No. So, you know, for example, if they see water pollution in the river and so on, they should contact the Environment Agency. But nonetheless, you know, would you welcome engagement with the general public?
And this is something that we discuss a lot, actually, at the OEP. So we're a strategic body. We're small, about 70 people. We're in one place, Worcester. Obviously, in that situation, you're relying quite a lot on your website, you know, and if you search, how do I complain about the environment, we will sort of come up. We work quite closely with those bodies we oversee to make sure that they know our role and are able to, in turn, explain the role when they're dealing with the public as well. So, and then we work really hard to explain on our website how you make a complaint to us. And often people are complaining and they don't quite know which is the relevant public body they should be complaining about or whether there has been a breach of the law. And we go the extra mile to assist people to identify, well, where might their complaint really be to and is there a breach or not potentially. We have, as well as dealing with complaints, we're quite happy dealing with inquiries. We've had over 500 inquiries from the public during the short period that we've been there. So we are, I think, making good efforts, if you like, but it is a constant battle. We're not going to be well known, are we? Because we're rather a niche body, but we need to be known enough that when people can see a serious issue, that they can raise it with us.
But ultimately, just to be really clear, if an individual has repeatedly tried to get an enforcement body to act and they've repeatedly failed to do so in their judgment, they can raise a complaint, a formal complaint with you, and you'll look into it.
If it's serious, we will. Because we're not, as I've said before, serial nitpickers, we have to be careful. Indeed, the law requires us to consider whether a complaint is serious or not. And we do set out our guidance on how we go about that. And obviously there's a large amount of... It is. So yes, we will take forward serious matters.
And a lot of that will be, is there a pattern of failure by an enforcement body?
Exactly, or if you can see a systemic issue and we can see that we at the OEP could make a difference, a positive difference.
How long is your term as chair?
5 years.
5 years. So my final question to you tonight, Dame Glenys Stacey. At the end of your 5 years as chair of this new body, the Office of Environmental Protection, when you look back at the end of your time as the very first chair of this body, what would make you happy if you reflected back?
Right.
What would have been a success?
Okay, so I would think a demonstrable difference and improvement in the environment is ultimately, you know, in that 5-year period, I would hope to be able to point to something. So, for example, I would like to see by then sufficient evidence to show that some of the interim targets that we're expecting from government next week are actually being met. You know, that we're on course to deliver, at least for those interim targets. I would like to see a really well-shaped, effective environmental improvement plan given centre stage in government so that it is not sort of put on a shelf and other priorities prevail, that the environment is given the place it deserves centre stage. That's what we are aiming for in the OEP. The further I can, with my colleagues, get to that point, and hopefully within my term, the better. In the meantime, we have a significant job to do, don't we, in doing our annual monitoring, improving the data that government and we rely on, making sure we pick up any shortcomings and certainly any lack of compliance with the law, making sure that all of those aspects of the Environment Act, which come together to create good governance, the targets, the environmental principles policy statement, the EIP, and of course, as all work together and are put into effect in the way Parliament intended to best protect, restore and enhance the environment. I'm pretty clear, what success looks like, and we are earnestly working to achieve it, hopefully within my term of office.
Good, thank you very much, and you can be assured the Wildlife Trust will want to work with you to deliver on all of that. Absolutely essential. Dame Glenys Stacey, thank you so much for joining Wildlife tonight and talking to the Wildlife Trust and answering all the questions I've tried to throw at you, and throw as many as I can in the space of an hour. Thank you very much. We do appreciate it, and best of luck with that mission that you've set out. We do need a really strong independent Office of Environmental Protection, so best of luck with that. And I do encourage you to look at the report that was published just last week by the OEP. It's pretty stark reading. Now, before we go, I just want to say a thing or two about the next Wildlife. It will be on the 28th of February. It's 3 years on from when the government gave the green light for HS2. So we thought it would be good to have a Wildlife pulling together a range of experts to specifically talk about HS2 and a wider sort of remit about what does sustainable transport really look like. And we might have some sort of new information that might be relevant to that as well. So put it in your diary, 28th of February, our next Wildlife looking at HS2. It's a topic that always provokes a lot of interest and attention. So that's going to be quite a heated Wildlife, I can be sure of that. If you've enjoyed this Wildlife tonight, please do hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel, both to make sure you don't miss any other future live streams from the Wildlife Trust, and indeed so you can follow all the videos that we're putting out from across the Wildlife Trusts. And of course, also make sure you follow us on social media as well, so you don't miss any developments from the Wildlife Trust. I can assure you there's an awful lot going on right now. People working furiously, very busily, right across the Wildlife Trust to try and bring nature back. And huge amounts of information going out on our social media channels from individual Wildlife Trusts and from us nationally as well, and on our YouTube channels. I find it hard to keep up with it, so but we should all make sure we look at it. It's really important. But for now, I want to again thank Dame Glenys Stacey for joining us tonight and doing such a good job of answering these questions and giving greater clarity about the role of the Office of Environment Protection. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for all your comments and questions. Good night. See you at the next one.